Have you ever noticed how whenever society faces just a massive, incredibly complex crisis, a surprisingly simple answer always seems to emerge from the chaos?
Oh, absolutely. Like clockwork.
Right. I mean, we're talking about truly staggering stuff here, like a sudden economic collapse, a global pandemic, or, a massive cultural shift. You're sitting there overwhelmed, and suddenly someone hands you this perfectly simple answer.
And it usually comes with a very specific, neatly defined group of people to blame for the whole mess.
Exactly. It's wild. You go to sleep worrying about, I don't know, global supply chains or a mutating virus, and you wake up being told the real problem is actually this specific marginalized group or scientists or
Yeah.
some shadowy cabal.
Yeah, it operates almost like a law of physics in human sociology. I mean, when the actual causes of societal pain are invisible or systemic or just too tangled to easily comprehend, human nature just fiercely demands a face for its frustrations.
Because the abstract is terrifying.
Completely terrifying. A localized physical enemy is something you can understand. It's something you can theoretically defeat.
Well, that psychological demand for a physical enemy is exactly the engine we're unpacking today. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we are looking at a brilliant, razor-sharp analysis by Herman Forwood.
Yeah, it's an incredible piece of writing.
It really is. It's titled Scapegoating, the oldest trick in the Populist Playbook. And our mission today is to figure out the psychological mechanics of why this works so well.
And what's great about Forward's approach is that he strips away all the specific political noise of any given era. He exposes the underlying machinery of populism itself.
Right, he doesn't treat scapegoating as just some tragic byproduct of human prejudice. He treats it as a highly calculated strategic weapon.
Which it is.
Hmm.
And I think it's important to set the tone here right at the start. Our goal today isn't to take political sides.
No, not at all.
We are just impartially unpacking the mechanics of populism as described in the source material. We're looking at how this tool is used across the entire political spectrum to weaponize fear.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The utility of that weapon becomes incredibly obvious when you look at the life cycle of a populist movement. Where does Forward start?
Well, he pinpoints a very specific moment in that life cycle. He calls it the inflection point.
The inflection point. Okay.
Yeah.
What does that look like on the ground?
So a populist movement usually gains traction by validating very real grievances. People were dealing with wage stagnation or their communities are fundamentally changing.
And they feel entirely ignored by the establishment.
Exactly. They feel invisible. So the populist leader rises by stepping up to a microphone and validating that anger. They say, I see your pain and I alone can fix it.
Right, which feels amazing to hear. But eventually the campaign ends.
The cheering stops. The movement actually secures power, or at least enough influence that they are expected to deliver results.
They hit the wall. The day after the victory, the rent is still due, the factories are still closed, and those complex international trade deficits haven't magically resolved themselves.
Yeah, suddenly the populist leader has to actually govern. They have to explain how to fix the broken systems.
And the brutal reality is that explaining why a global economy is broken is just excruciatingly boring.
It's so boring. It involves macroeconomics, historical precedents, slow-moving bureaucratic logistics.
And usually it involves telling the public that fixing it will require years of shared sacrifice. Slow, incremental change. Nobody wants to hear that. That does not get the blood pumping at a rally.
Not at all. And the psychological weight of that complexity is exhausting. When you as a citizen are in crisis, worried about feeding your family or losing your home, your cognitive bandwidth is just maxed out.
Nuance feels like an insult.
It really does. So Forward makes this compelling argument that this exact moment, the realization that real change is too slow and complex to sell, is when scapegoating is deployed. It's a manufactured distraction.
He calls it the mask populace wear to disguise the absence of actual solutions.
Yes,
Right?
that's the exact phrase.
It makes me think of a magician. Relying entirely on sleight of hand. You go to a magic show, and the magician creates this massive, sudden burst of fire on the left side of the stage.
Right, the misdirection.
Exactly. That flashing light is the scapegoat. The audience is absolutely transfixed by the flames, entirely unaware that the magician is directing their attention over there solely because his other hand is completely empty.
The hand that's supposed to be doing the actual work?
Yeah, passing the legislation, fixing the economy, it's empty. And that misdirection, it taps directly into the raw emotional centers of the brain. It bypasses critical thought completely.
Because if you can convince a population that the machine of society isn't broken because of 1,000 unglamorous failing gears, but rather because that specific guy over there intentionally threw a wrench into it.
You offer the public immense psychological relief.
Exactly. You've taken a systemic nightmare and turned it into a localized villain. And Forwood points out that this misdirection serves a secondary, equally vital purpose for the movement. He calls scapegoating the glue of false unity.
Oh, wow. The glue of false unity.
Yeah, think about it. When that inability to provide real solutions becomes apparent, the movement naturally risks fracturing. Supporters might start looking around and asking hard questions about the lack of progress.
But if you supply a shared enemy, you instantly forge a new, unbreakable bond.
You do. The supporters are no longer united by a shared positive vision for a better future because that vision has stalled out. Instead, they're united by a shared, visceral hatred of the scapegoat.
The anger completely replaces the need for answers.
Right. The rage effectively becomes the policy.
It's so dark. But it makes perfect sense. Okay, so if we accept that scapegoating is the mask the flashing light used to distract a fractured society, the obvious question is how a populist leader decides who to point the spotlight at.
How do they choose the materials to make that mask, basically?
Exactly. And Forwood is incredibly granular about this. He separates everyday, run-of-the-mill prejudice from what he calls strategic bigotry.
This is such a crucial distinction in the text. Everyday prejudice is a sociological flaw. It's the biases that exist in the background of any culture. But strategic bigotry is a surgical operation.
It's intentional.
Highly intentional. Populist leaders don't just happen to other a group of people in a fit of spontaneous anger. They actively weaponize group identity.
And they select their targets based on a very cold, highly calculated formula.
They do. And the formula Forwood outlines is chilling in its simplicity. He states that the ideal scapegoat must be, and I'm quoting here, different enough to be blamed, but too small or too polite to fight back effectively.
Let's break that down. That first half, different enough,
Yeah.
that just means there has to be some existing societal friction, right? A difference in religion, social norms, maybe language.
Yeah, it provides the initial hook for the narrative. You need something for people to point at.
But the really insidious genius lies in the second half of that formula. Too small or too polite to fight back.
Because a populist movement relies entirely on the projection of absolute strength. If a leader picks an enemy that is genuinely powerful, like a massive, well-funded institution or a rival nation with a strong military, they risk actually losing the confrontation.
And losing shatters the illusion of the populist's invincibility.
Exactly. So they must select an opponent they can reliably, publicly defeat without incurring any real risk to their own movement.
They aren't going after Goliath. They're finding someone vulnerable and painting them to look like Goliath.
That's a great way to put it. Let's look at how Forwood applies this formula to historical examples.
Yeah, he starts with the historical targeting of Jewish populations, framing them as secret elites.
Right. In various European nations over the centuries, Jewish communities were a minority, which checks the small enough box.
And because of systemic marginalization, they were often pushed into specific insular communities or professions, providing that different enough hook.
Exactly. The populist narrative then takes this small, vulnerable minority and inflates them into an all-powerful, shadowy cabal that secretly controls global finance and politics.
So the populist leader gets to play the brave hero slaying a dragon, when in reality they're just attacking a vulnerable minority.
It's all theater, and we see the exact same mathematical formula applied to immigrants. By definition, immigrants are different because they arrive from outside the established culture.
More importantly, they are almost entirely devoid of institutional power. They lack voting rights, they often lack financial resources, and they don't have deep-seated political representation.
They literally cannot fight back through standard political channels. So when a society faces a complex housing shortage or a decade of wage stagnation due to automation and globalization,
The populist neatly pins all of that massive macroeconomic failure onto the powerless newcomer. It's so cynical.
it really is. Forwood also highlights the modern targeting of the trans community, framing them as a threat to children. This is a textbook application of the vulnerability formula.
Yeah, because the trans community is an incredibly small minority of the general population. They represent a departure from traditional gender norms, which makes them highly visible targets for the different enough criteria.
And by framing this small group not just as different, but as an active predatory threat to the most vulnerable members of society, children, The populist generates an instant, overwhelming emotional panic.
The complex, nuanced reality of human biology and gender identity is entirely erased. It's replaced by a primal, protective rage. You take a tiny minority and turn them into a terrifying monster hiding under the bed.
And what's fascinating is that the formula isn't restricted to marginalized social or ethnic groups. Forward points out that professionals and civil servants are routinely drafted into the role of the scapegoat, too.
Wait, really? Like who?
He points to scientists being framed as conspirators and government workers being labeled as deep state saboteurs. This perfectly illustrates the too polite to fight back clause of the formula.
Oh, right, because scientists and bureaucrats operate within strict professional constraints.
Yeah. Exactly. If a populist leader stands on a stage and attacks a climatologist or an epidemiologist with a wild, emotionally charged conspiracy theory,
The scientist's instinct and their professional obligation is to respond with peer-reviewed data, cautious language, and statistical probabilities. They bring a spreadsheet to a knife fight.
that's it exactly. They're institutionally constrained from engaging in the kind of visceral, street-level rhetorical brawling that the populace thrives on.
That institutional politeness makes them incredibly convenient targets. When a leader needs to explain away a devastating pandemic or the economic impacts of a changing climate without taking any personal responsibility, the polite scientist is the perfect flashing light.
The perfect target.
I look at these examples, the marginalized minorities, the immigrants, the civil servants, and I have to ask you, is there ever a situation where the choice of the scapegoat is based on an actual systemic threat they pose? Or is it purely a cynical calculation of who happens to be the most convenient punching bag at that specific cultural moment?
Forward's analysis makes it abundantly clear that it is entirely the latter. The objective threat level of the group is completely irrelevant to the populist.
So the threat is always manufactured.
Yes. In fact, an actual powerful threat makes for a terrible scapegoat because it requires actual work and risk to defeat. The vulnerability is the point.
Wow.
When Forward describes populism as simplifying problems into a single convenient culprit, the word convenient is doing the heavy lifting there. The selection process is driven by what the leader needs in that exact moment to maintain their grip on the public's attention.
Not by any objective measure of societal danger. That implies that literally any group, no matter how embedded or ordinary, could be suddenly drafted into the role of the villain if the political winds shift.
Absolutely any group.
And that brings us to the history. Because if this psychological cheat code is universally appealing, we should expect to see it weaponized across completely different cultures, eras, and political systems.
And we do. Forward explicitly maps this out, proving that the formula of strategic bigotry is not owned by any single ideology. It operates with terrifying efficiency on both the far right and the far left.
Which again, just as a reminder for you listening, we are impartially reporting on the historical examples from the text here. This isn't about taking a political side, it's about seeing how this tool is used across the board.
Right. Looking at the historical context really strips away the illusion that scapegoating is tied to any specific political platform. Let's look at the nationalist and right-wing examples Forward highlights, starting with Germany in the aftermath of World War I.
Okay, the Weimar Republic. The situation there wasn't just a political disagreement, it was a total societal collapse.
Complete collapse.
The economic ruin was absolute. You had that hyperinflation crisis where the currency became so worthless that citizens were literally taking wheelbarrows full of cash to the bakery just to buy a single loaf of bread.
It's hard to even imagine living through that. Compounding that was the deep national humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, which placed the entire moral and financial burden of the war on Germany.
The cognitive dissonance for the everyday German citizen must have been staggering. They had been told they were the greatest empire on earth, and suddenly they were starving in the streets.
And in that environment of absolute desperation, the populist mechanism was deployed with devastating effect. The leadership did not offer a nuanced, multi-decade plan for restructuring international debt and rebuilding domestic industry.
Because that would not have satiated the public's rage.
Exactly. Instead, the narrative shifted the entirety of this complex geopolitical failure onto the Jewish population. Jews were drafted as the convenient scapegoat to explain away the systemic failure of the German state.
The public traded the terrifying reality of a broken nation for the comforting lie of a localized enemy.
Culminating, of course, in the horrors of the Holocaust.
But the exact same mechanism, the exact same sleight of hand, operates on the opposite end of the political spectrum. Forward pivots directly to the Russian Revolution. to illustrate
Yeah,
this.
and this is crucial to understand. The Russian Revolution did not begin with the rhetoric of racial animus or ethnic cleansing. It began with ideals that sounded profoundly positive to an oppressed populace.
Things like the pursuit of equality, justice, and the liberation of the working class from the tyranny of the czars.
It was built on the promise of a utopian restructuring of society. But eventually, the Bolsheviks overthrew the regime, seized control, and hit that inevitable inflection point.
They woke up the next day realizing that managing the agricultural output and industrial logistics of a massive, fractured, freezing nation was significantly harder than storming the Winter
A
Palace.
bit more complicated, yeah. And the utopian policies, particularly forced agricultural collectivization, began to fail catastrophically. Millions were starving.
The machine was breaking down, and the regime couldn't exactly admit that their foundational economic theories were flawed.
They could not. They needed a flashing light. So they deployed the scapegoat mechanism, and the target was a rotating cast of villains. Forward specifically mentions the kulaks.
Right, the kulaks.
Yeah.
This is a perfect example of strategic bigotry in action, because originally a kulak was just a slightly more prosperous peasant, right? Maybe someone who owned a larger farm or hired seasonal labor.
Exactly. But when the state farms failed to produce enough grain, the definition of a kulak was intentionally, maliciously expanded. It became a mathematical tool for assigning blame.
How so?
Well, if you owned 2 cows instead of 1, you were a kulak. If you had a tin roof instead of thatch, you were a kulak. Eventually, if you simply resisted handing over your winter grain supply to the state so your family wouldn't starve, you were labeled a wealthy, capitalist saboteur.
Wow. So the state needed someone to blame for the starvation, so they took ordinary farmers, labeled them enemies of the working class, and shipped them to the gulags.
The failure was never attributed to bad policy. It was always the fault of these manufactured internal saboteurs.
We see the identical dynamic in Mao's Cultural Revolution. Forward notes how landowners and moderates were relentlessly scapegoated. The Great Leap Forward had resulted in unimaginable famine.
Just absolute devastation.
And to distract from the catastrophic failure of state planning, Mao empowered the youth to turn on their elders, their teachers, and their neighbors. The definition of a moderate or a counter-revolutionary became so loose that merely wearing glasses or owning a foreign book or expressing a desire for a stable income was enough to have you publicly beaten or executed.
The state manufactured an endless supply of internal enemies to keep the population violently occupied and entirely distracted from the fact that the government couldn't feed them.
Forward also touches on Latin American leftist uprisings, noting their frequent reliance on the catch-all phrase, enemies of the revolution.
From a dark strategic standpoint, a phrase like enemies of the revolution is flawlessly designed. It is entirely malleable.
Because an enemy isn't a specific demographic you might eventually run out of, it is an abstract concept that the leader can redefine on a daily basis.
Exactly. Whoever the leader needs to blame on any given Tuesday can be neatly filed under that label.
It's a blank check for blame. And Forward doesn't let the United States off the hook either. He brings the analysis right into the American experience.
He does. And he lists a staggering variety of groups that have been drafted into the scapegoat role during moments of national anxiety, rapid cultural shifts, or economic downturns.
The American historical record is rife with this tactic. Forward lists Black Americans, feminists, the gay and trans communities, scientists, socialists, communists, and immigrants.
Whenever the American public has faced the discomfort of evolution, whether it's the integration of the workforce, the shifting of gender roles, the loss of manufacturing jobs, or the complexities of a globalized economy,
Populist voices have invariably reached into that toolbox and pulled out one or more of these groups to serve as the single convenient culprit.
always looking at this massive, contradictory historical record where the designated villain shifts from wealthy landowners in China to impoverished immigrants in America to Jewish populations in Europe to basic farmers in Russia, the core thesis crystallizes.
Left-wing ideology isn't inherently the problem. Right-wing ideology isn't inherently the problem. The catalyst for the violence is populism itself.
Populism takes any ideology, regardless of its founding principles, and mutates it into a weapon the moment it decides to govern through anger instead of policy.
It is the operating system that runs underneath the political rhetoric. And what makes that operating system so terrifyingly effective is how it interacts with human psychology.
This brings us to the most uncomfortable part of Forward's analysis, I think.
Yeah, the why. Why do everyday people who consider themselves decent, who love their families, who go to work and pay their taxes, Why do they fall for the exact same trick, century after century?
Because the pitch is irresistible. Forward distills the psychological core of the populist pitch down to a single seductive concept.
Which is, you're not failing. The system is rigged against you, and we know exactly who did it.
To truly understand the power of that pitch, you have to empathize with the psychological state of a person in crisis. When you are struggling to keep your head above water financially, or when you feel like the culture you grew up in is evaporating and you no longer recognize your own country,
You carry an immense burden of shame and anxiety.
you do. You lie awake wondering if you made the wrong choices, if you are inadequate, if it's your fault. The populist steps up to a podium and offers a total unconditional absolution of that shame.
They look you in the eye and say, your pain is real, and absolutely none of it is your fault.
It's what the text calls a twisted kind of empowerment.
I look at it like discovering a psychological cheat code that short-circuits human insecurity. Think about it. Imagine you are taking an incredibly difficult, almost impossible exam in school. You are failing miserably. You feel stupid, you feel anxious, your self-worth is plummeting.
We've all had that feeling.
Right. And suddenly, someone walks into the room, snatches the test off your desk, and hands you a completely different narrative. They say, actually, you are a genius. The only reason you are failing is because the teacher is part of a grand, malicious conspiracy against you, and they rigged the test from the moment you sat down.
The profound physical and emotional relief of that moment cannot be overstated. You have taken a complex, painful reality that you are struggling and might need to work harder or adapt, and replaced it with a highly satisfying lie.
Because people in a state of chronic stress crave clarity above all else.
Ambiguity, not knowing why you can't pay the rent, not understanding complex economic shifts creates a terrifying cognitive dissonance. Scapegoating provides an illusion of clarity that is biologically soothing.
It literally lowers stress hormones, doesn't it?
It does. It gives the follower a concrete reason for their suffering, making them feel seen and understood.
And it does something even more potent. It grants them moral superiority. Because if the system is rigged, and this specific marginalized group is responsible for the rigging, then you aren't just a passive victim of circumstance.
You are a righteous warrior fighting back against evil.
The narrative flips your emotional state from a depressed, paralyzed anxiety into an energized, righteous anger. And when you've spent years feeling powerless, anger feels exactly like power.
It feels like agency. It feels like taking the wheel back. But Forward is relentless in pointing out the fatal flaw in this psychological transaction.
Right, because it feels incredibly empowering when you were standing in a crowd of thousands, chanting the same slogans, united in your shared rage against the flashing light. But the rally always ends.
What happens the next day when the follower wakes up and realizes that while they feel morally vindicated, the underlying problems haven't actually been solved?
The rent is still exactly what it was yesterday. The factory hasn't reopened. The complexities of the world are still right there waiting for them.
This is where the deep dive pivots into the uncontrollable, mutating nature of the scapegoating mob. Forward describes this dynamic as a monster with no off switch.
The lack of an off switch is the defining characteristic of a mature populist movement. Let's go back to your magician analogy.
The hand doing the actual work of governing is completely empty. The populist leader has no viable policy solutions for the failing economy or the cultural shifts.
So, as the followers realize their lives aren't materially improving, that massive reservoir of anger threatens to turn back onto the leader. The leader is suddenly in existential danger.
To survive, the leader has to keep the audience distracted. They have to keep the flashing light burning.
But here's the catch. The original scapegoat might have already been marginalized, deported, imprisoned, or entirely defeated. Or the crowd simply gets bored of hating the same enemy when it doesn't result in a better life.
The distraction loses its potency, so the monster gets hungry again.
And this is the terrifying reality. Once a population is trained to substitute critical thought with hatred, it is nearly impossible to control where that hatred looks for its next meal.
Forward writes, and this is a great quote, "The mob doesn't stay polite. The pitchforks don't get put away after the rally." The movement requires a constant, fresh supply of enemies to sustain its own momentum.
Which leads directly to the phenomenon of the movement cannibalizing itself. Yesterday's ally becomes today's traitor.
The people who cheered the loudest, the people who helped build the very mechanisms of the purge, inevitably find themselves targeted by it.
Forward provides three incredibly stark historical examples of this dynamic: Maximilian Robespierre, Leon Trotsky, and Liz Cheney. We need to look closely at how each of these insiders was meticulously transformed into an outsider.
Let's examine Robespierre during the French Revolution. He was not a fringe figure. He was the central architect of the Reign of Terror.
He masterfully utilized the scapegoating mechanism to violently purge France of enemies of the revolution.
He started with the obvious targets, the aristocracy and the clergy. He rode the tiger of populist rage to absolute, unchecked power.
But chopping off the heads of dukes didn't solve the fact that France was fighting massive wars and the peasants were still starving. The underlying crises were untouched.
Exactly. Because the material conditions of the citizens didn't improve, the demand for scapegoats accelerated. Robespierre couldn't just say, well, we ran out of aristocrats, let's focus on agricultural reform.
He had to expand the definition of the enemy.
The law of suspects was broadened until anyone deemed insufficiently radical or anyone who simply lacked enthusiasm for the executions was targeted. The net kept widening, catching moderate revolutionaries, former allies.
And eventually, the mob's paranoia turned squarely on Robespierre himself. The architect of the guillotine was executed by the very mechanism he championed. The pitchfork simply found a new direction to point.
Leon Trotsky's fate in the Soviet Union follows the exact same trajectory. Trotsky wasn't just a participant in the Russian Revolution. Alongside Lenin, he was a founding father of the Soviet state.
He created and led the Red Army. He was the ultimate in-group ally.
But after Lenin died and Joseph Stalin began consolidating absolute power, the Soviet state was facing monumental internal failures. The rapid industrialization and agricultural mandates were causing mass death.
Stalin needed an explanation for why the socialist utopia was failing to materialize, and he needed a villain large enough to carry the weight of that failure.
Trotsky, despite his foundational role in the revolution, was drafted as the ultimate scapegoat. The narrative was violently shifted. The term Trotskyite became a catch-all death sentence.
He was systematically erased from historical photographs, exiled, and eventually assassinated. The movement devoured one of its creators because the engine of blame required a high-profile sacrifice to distract from state incompetence.
And Forward brings this mechanism right into the modern era, demonstrating how it operates today without necessarily ending in physical violence, but utilizing the exact same psychological architecture.
He points to Liz Cheney in contemporary U.S. politics. Now, stripping away all political bias and looking purely at the mechanics, Liz Cheney was a deeply entrenched member of the conservative establishment.
She had a voting record that aligned with her party's conservative platform over 90% of the time. She was policy-aligned royalty within her movement.
From a traditional policy-driven perspective, she was the definition of an ally. Her conservative credentials were unassailable.
But populism, as we've established, doesn't actually care about policy. It cares about absolute loyalty to the narrative and the shared anger.
When Cheney publicly challenged the populist narrative regarding the 2020 election, she broke the cardinal rule. She stopped pointing at the designated flashing light.
She broke the false unity, and the speed with which the narrative shifted was breathtaking. Her decades of ideological alignment, her voting record, none of it acted as a shield.
Almost overnight, the machinery of the movement reclassified her from a foundational leader to a traitor, a rhino, an enemy of the people.
It perfectly illustrates the mutation. The mob's focus shifted to her because the populist engine requires absolute narrative compliance. When the external enemies fail to sustain the energy, the movement turns its gaze inward, looking for ideological impurities to purge.
When I look at Robespierre, Trotsky, and Cheney, I keep coming back to a central question. Does the populist leader eventually lose control of the mob? Is it a Frankenstein scenario where the creator realizes the monster is loose and acting on its own?
Or does the leader intentionally, actively keep throwing their own allies to the wolves just to keep the engine of rage running?
Yeah, exactly. Which is it?
Based on Forward synthesis, it is heavily weighted toward intentionality. The movement structurally requires an enemy to survive. It's not an accident, it is the fuel source.
When one enemy is defeated, or when the public's attention starts to wander toward the lack of actual governance, a new enemy must be manufactured.
And finding that new enemy within your own ranks serves a brilliant, dark purpose. It provides a built-in excuse for past failures.
Oh, I see. The leader can say, we didn't fail to fix the economy because our ideas were bad. We failed because we were secretly betrayed from within by these traitors.
Exactly. The leader might lose control of the day-to-day chaos, but the demand for fresh meat is a feature, not a bug, of the system they built.
That structural demand for enemies leads us directly into the final section of Forward's analysis. This insatiable hunger creates a highly predictable, ultimately fatal loop.
Forward breaks down the life cycle of destructive populism into a rigid five-step cycle. When you look at history through this lens, the pattern is undeniable. Let's walk through it.
The cycle begins with step 1, claim moral clarity. The movement establishes an absolute, uncompromising us versus them dynamic.
It defines the movement not merely as a group with differing political opinions, but as the sole, pure force of good fighting against an existential evil. This establishes the absolute purity of the in-group.
Which is necessary for step 2, identify the enemy. Because the movement has declared itself inherently pure, any problems, struggles, or societal decay must be the result of an external contaminant.
This is the moment the formula is deployed, and the leader selects that convenient, vulnerable target. The group different enough to blame, but too small or polite to effectively fight back.
Once the target is acquired, the machinery shifts into step 3, stoke division and blame. This is the activation of the rage engine.
It encompasses the rallies, the relentless media campaigns, the inflammatory rhetoric that hammers home a single message. This identified enemy is the root cause of every hardship you face.
It is the intentional pouring of gasoline on societal friction. And all of that noise, all of that heat, provides the cover for step 4, consolidate power.
While the public is utterly consumed by their rage against the scapegoat, the populist leadership leverages that false unity to quietly, fundamentally alter the system.
They bypass democratic norms, they place loyalists in key institutional roles, they dismantle checks and balances.
The audience is staring at the blinding, flashing light of the scapegoat, completely failing to notice that the leader's empty hand is quietly grabbing the keys to the entire kingdom.
Which inevitably drives the movement to step 5, the final conclusion of the cycle. Forward phrases it bluntly. Burn out or burn everything down.
A political movement built entirely on the perpetual escalation of conflict rather than the evolution of policy has a finite lifespan. It has nowhere else to go but toward destruction.
The structure of this cycle reminds me of a pyramid scheme, but instead of scamming people out of money, it's a pyramid scheme of outrage.
A pyramid scheme of outrage. I like that.
Because in a financial pyramid scheme, the structure only survives if you constantly recruit a fresh layer of new investors at the bottom to pay off the people at the top. But mathematically, you eventually run out of new people on Earth to recruit.
And when you hit that wall, the money stops flowing, the illusion shatters, and the entire structure collapses in on itself, ruining almost everyone involved.
Exactly. In the populist cycle, the currency isn't money, it's enemies. You constantly need to recruit new scapegoats, new traitors, to blame for the lack of actual societal improvement.
You have to keep expanding the definition of enemy to maintain the emotional high of the movement. But eventually, you run out of convenient targets. The circle of the pure gets smaller and smaller as the movement relentlessly cannibalizes its own ranks.
Until the entire structure collapses under the crushing weight of its own paranoia and incompetence. Because you cannot govern a society with paranoia.
You really cannot. And Forward stresses why this cycle is inherently fatal, particularly in our modern, deeply interconnected world.
Scapegoating is not just a moral or ethical failing. It is a structural impossibility as a governance strategy.
You cannot fix a multifaceted globalized economy or address shifting demographics or manage a public health crisis by randomly attacking isolated segments of your own population.
Attacking immigrants doesn't build houses. Purging scientists doesn't cure diseases. It merely creates new targets, new victims, and entirely new reasons for societal instability.
It is the equivalent of trying to repair a highly complex broken computer by systematically smashing its various components with a hammer. You're just generating more debris.
Forward concludes this entire analysis with a line that honestly stopped me in my tracks. Is the most haunting sentence in the piece. He writes, "The most dangerous thing about scapegoating isn't the hate. It's how good it feels to aim it at someone else."
That sentence is the absolute crux of the issue. The true danger of populism isn't that the leaders are supernatural, evil geniuses.
The danger is that they have discovered a glaring vulnerability in the source code of human psychology, and they are ruthlessly exploiting it.
They are mass marketing a highly addictive product. The intoxicating feeling of righteous anger and the total absolution of personal or societal guilt.
Human beings are deeply biologically primed to consume that product when they feel afraid or disenfranchised. It genuinely feels good to point a finger and say, it's your fault.
And it feels agonizing to look in the mirror and admit that the world is terrifyingly complicated, that our systems are failing, and that our problems don't have easy villains we can just defeat to make it all better.
We have covered a massive amount of conceptual and historical ground today. If we pull all of this together into a cohesive takeaway for you from Forwood's text, it's this. Scapegoating is an illusion.
It is a highly calculated strategic misdirection used impartially by populists across the entire political spectrum, from the architects of the French Revolution to the fascist regimes of the 20th century, from communist purges to modern political theater.
It is the mask they wear to hide their inability to actually solve complex problems. It is a mechanism that deliberately preys on the most vulnerable, convenient groups in society to provide a fake, fleeting sense of psychological empowerment to a public desperate for answers.
And as we've seen through the five-step cycle, it is a mechanism that ultimately traps societies in a fatal loop. It demands an endless supply of enemies, forcing the movement to cannibalize itself until it either burns out from exhaustion or burns the entire society down around it.
Understanding this machinery is heavy, but it is the prerequisite for dismantling it.
Recognizing the sleight of hand is the only way to break the trance. When you see the populist pitch not as a profound truth, but as a pyramid scheme of outrage, it loses its seductive power.
That recognition is the moment a society stops accepting satisfying, destructive lies and begins demanding the hard, complex work or actual solutions.
Which is the only way forward.
I want to leave you with a thought to mull over, building directly on the mechanics we've just unpacked. Forwood established that the entire engine of populist scapegoating relies absolutely on the target being vulnerable, too small or too polite to fight back. The machinery requires the victim to be easily isolated.
Right.
So what happens when those targeted groups recognize the playbook being used against them? What if entirely different vulnerable groups that historically might have very little to do with one another, realized they were just different fuel sources for the same machine?
Wow, that's an interesting thought experiment.
Imagine if immigrant communities, civil servants, marginalized minorities, and targeted scientists formed an unprecedented horizontal alliance, collectively refusing the scapegoat label. If the isolated target suddenly linked arms, would the populist engine choke on its own rage because the target became too massive and unified to victimize? Or would the machine just spin faster, desperate to break them apart?
A phenomenal question to leave on.
Think about that the next time you see a politician standing at a podium, pointing a finger and offering you a single, incredibly simple villain for all of your complex problems. We'll see you next time. Stay curious.